I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, catching up on the bank balance, and wondering if the price of oil and vinegar dressing had been affected by the latest international spat, when the doorbell rang. Ordinarily, a doorbell at 10 in the morning is just the postman, or a man trying to sell Wolfe a subscription to a magazine he'd never read. But this ring had a certain frantic rhythm to it, 3 shorts and a long, like a desperate telegraph operator with a nervous tick. I glanced at the monitor. It wasn't a salesman. It was a woman in a mink coat that cost more than my last 3 cars combined, looking as though she'd just escaped a sinking ship. I walked to the front door, slid the bolt and opened it just enough to be polite but not enough to let in a draft. "Yes," I said, giving her the Archie Goodwin smile, the one that usually gets a name and a reason for living. "I must see Mr. Wolfe," she gasped. She didn't just say it, she exhaled it, along with a cloud of expensive perfume that smelled like a botanical garden after a thunderstorm. "It's about Elena sur nuo sonora. She's gone." "Mr. Wolfe is with his plants," I told her, my tone as level as a billiard table. "He is never disturbed between 9 and 11. Not for missing persons, not for missing empires. If you'd care to wait in the front room, I can offer you a chair and a magazine, though I can't guarantee the chair won't be harder than your current mood." She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me with the kind of entitlement that comes from having a grandfather who owned most of the railroads in the Southwest. She was Clara Sonora, the matriarch of the Sonora copper fortune. I recognized her from the Sunday supplements. She looked 70, but the kind of 70 that spends 2 hours a day being massaged, and another 2 being lied to by a plastic surgeon. I led her into the office. Nero Wolfe was, as I'd said, upstairs in the plant rooms on the roof, probably telling a phalaenopsis that its color was ostentatious. I sat Clara down in the red leather chair, the one that has seen more liars and losers than a night court judge, and went to my desk to wait out the clock. At exactly 11 o'clock, the sound of the elevator signaled the descent of the mountain. The door opened and Wolfe left. He caught sight of the visitor, and his face did that thing where it doesn't move a muscle but somehow conveys a profound desire to be back in the 19th century. He crossed the room, his 500 pounds of genius and stubbornness moving with the surprising grace of a cargo ship in calm water, and settled behind his desk. He didn't look at Clara. He looked at me. "Archie, there is an intruder. This is Mrs. Clara Sonora, sir," I said. "She's been waiting 40 minutes. Her niece Elena has vanished, and she seems to think we're the ones to find her." Wolfe sighed, a sound like air escaping a very large tire. He shifted his gaze to the woman. "Mrs. Sonora, I do not find people. I am not a bloodhound. If your niece has decamped, the police are equipped with the necessary bureaucracy to locate her." "The police are fools," Clara snapped. Her voice regained its steel, and Elena hasn't just decamped. She was to sign the trust reorganization papers yesterday at 4 o'clock. If she doesn't sign them by Friday, the entire Sonora estate reverts to a charitable foundation controlled by my late husband's rivals. She knew this. She wanted the money. She wouldn't leave of her own accord. Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits. He hates being told what people would or wouldn't do, mostly because he thinks he's the only one who knows. "And why come to me?" "Because," she said, leaning forward, "the last person she spoke to wasn't a friend or a lover. It was your chef, Fritz Brenner. She called this house 3 times yesterday morning." I felt the air in the room change. Usually the brownstone is a fortress. The idea that someone had been using our phone lines as a waypoint for a disappearance was like finding a smudge on one of Wolfe's pristine yellow silk shirts. Wolfe turned his head slowly toward the kitchen door. "Fritz?" The door opened almost instantly. Fritz stood there, drying his hands on his apron, looking as guilty as a man can look when he's done nothing wrong but knows he's about to be questioned. "Yes, Mr. Wolfe. Did you speak with Miss Elena Sonora yesterday?" Fritz hesitated, his eyes darting to the woman in the red chair. "I did, sir. She called to ask about the recipe for the sel d'agneau Orloff we served at the Gourmet Society dinner last month. She was very insistent. She said it was a matter of life and death." Wolfe's eyebrows rose a millimeter. To anyone else it was nothing, to me it was an earthquake. A recipe for lamb, Wolfe murmured. A matter of life and death, how singular. He looked at Mrs. Sonora. He wasn't annoyed anymore. He was intrigued, which is much more dangerous for everyone involved. He leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. Archie, take a check. 5,000 as a retainer. If Fritz's kitchen is being used as a backdrop for a disappearance, I suppose I must find out why. The $5,000 in the form of a certified check sat on Wolfe's desk like a bright rectangular intrusion. Wolfe didn't touch it. He rarely does. He eyes a check the way a biologist might eye a particularly resilient strain of bacteria, with a mixture of professional interest and personal distaste for the mess it represents. Mrs. Sonora had departed, leaving behind a trail of expensive scent and a heavy atmosphere of desperation that didn't belong in a room dedicated to the finer points of logic and beer drinking. Archie. Wolfe's voice was a low rumble, the kind that usually precedes a storm or a demand for more honey in his tea. The girl, Elena Sonora, what do we know of her, beyond her taste for lamb? I went to the files, though I didn't really need to. I keep a mental Rolodex of the city's high flyers, mostly to know which ones are likely to end up on our doorstep or in the morning headlines. 24, blonde, and currently the most expensive piece of driftwood in the Atlantic. She's the sole heir to the Sonora mining and rail interests, provided she survives her Aunt Clara's scrutiny and reaches 25, or signs the reorganization papers Mrs. Sonora mentioned. She spent the last 3 years making the gossip columnists' lives easy. Paris, Gstaad, and a brief, ill-advised stint in a dramatic art school that ended when she realized she had to be at rehearsals by 10 in the morning. Wolfe made a noise of profound disgust. He considers the act of being 24 a personal affront, and the pursuit of dramatic arts an exercise in organized lying. And she called Fritz for a recipe. Fritz, come in. Fritz entered again, his posture slightly more rigid than before. He doesn't like his kitchen being dragged into the office, and he likes it even less when his professional courtesy is questioned. The girl, Fritz, Wolfe said, his eyes closed. Relate the conversation, verbatim. Fritz cleared his throat. She called at 10:12 yesterday, sir. She was polite, but she sounded breathless. She didn't ask for you. She specifically asked the man who prepared the all-off lamb. She said she had tried to replicate the sauce, the onion and bechamel base, but it kept breaking. She asked if I used a specific brand of butter or if the temperature of the veal stock was the deciding factor. She said, and I quote, "If I don't get this right today, everything will fall apart." A culinary perfectionist, I suggested. Maybe she's just dedicated to the sauce. Nonsense, Wolfe snapped, his eyes open. A girl of her background and temperament does not vanish because of a broken soubise. She was using the recipe as a code or perhaps as a test of Fritz's presence. Or, more likely, she was attempting to establish a connection to this house without alerting someone who might be listening. Fritz, did she mention anyone else, any place, any specific time? Only that she was calling from a drafty hall, sir. I heard a bell in the background, a deep, resonant chime like a church or a very old clock tower. Thank you, Fritz, that will be all. Wolfe waited for the door to click shut before turning his gaze to me. Archie, the sanctity of this house has been compromised. A woman in distress has reached out to our kitchen and subsequently vanished. Her aunt, a woman who treats people like ledger entries, is now our client. This is not merely a disappearance, it is an insolence. Go to the girl's apartment. See what she left behind. If she was truly worried about a recipe, there will be evidence of it in her kitchen. If she was lying, there would be evidence of that, too. I grabbed my hat and coat. And if I find a pot of burnt bechamel? Then we shall have to find a motive for her to be a failure as a cook, Wolfe muttered, reaching for the button to signal for more beer. The Sonora penthouse was located on Park Avenue, in a building where the doormen looked like they'd been sculpted out of granite and tailored by the gods. I had to use the Sonora name and a bit of my own natural charm, plus the implicit threat of a phone call to Aunt Clara, to get the elevator man to turn the key. The apartment was a museum of the modern and the cold. It looked like the kind of place where you'd be afraid to sit down for fear of interrupting the architecture. I went straight to the kitchen. It was a chef's dream, filled with copper pots that hadn't seen a flame in months, and a refrigerator that contained 3 bottles of champagne, a jar of expensive olives, and exactly nothing that resembled a meal. There was no lamb, there was no onion soup, there wasn't even a smudge of flour on the marble counters. I moved to the living area. On a small mahogany writing desk, I found a notepad. The top sheet had been removed, but the indentations were still there. I did the old trick with a pencil, lightly shading the paper to see what had been written on the sheet above. It wasn't a grocery list, it was a series of numbers and one word, Acheron. I know my Greek mythology well enough to know that's the river of woe in the underworld, but in New York it was also the name of a high-stakes members-only gambling club that operated just north of 59th Street. I was about to leave when the front door opened. I didn't have time to hide, so I just leaned against the desk and tried to look like I belonged there. In walked a man who looked like he'd been folded out of a dark suit and a sour expression. He was mid-40s with hair that was starting to retreat from his forehead in a defensive maneuver. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. His voice had the grating quality of a rusted gate. "Archie Goodwin," I said, staying relaxed. "I'm the man who's wondering why you have a key to Miss Sonora's apartment. You don't look like a maid." "I'm Arthur Vance, her attorney," he said, entering the room. He didn't look relieved to see me. He looked like he wanted to check his pockets to see if I'd pinched his wallet. And if Clara Sonora hired Wolfe, she's wasting her money. Elena is just on a bender. She'll turn up when the champagne runs out. "Is that what you told the aunt?" I asked, because she seems to think there's a trust reorganization that needs a signature. Or maybe you're the one who stands to gain if that signature never happens? Vance's face became a peculiar shade of grey. "I represent the estate. My only interest is stability. Now, get out before I call the police." "I'll go," I said, moving toward the door. "But just a tip, next time you try to look like a concerned lawyer, try not to look so disappointed that the apartment is empty." I left, but I didn't go far. I waited in the service stairwell for 10 minutes until I heard the elevator arrive and depart. Then I went back outside. I had a word, a set of numbers, and a lawyer who was sweating through his expensive shirt. I headed back to the brownstone. The sun was dipping low, casting long, suspicious shadows over the city. When I walked into the office, Wolfe was at his desk, staring at a map of the city as if he could force the missing girl to appear by the sheer weight of his intellect. "The kitchen was a desert, sir," I reported, dropping my hat on the rack. "No lamb, no onions, no effort. But I found a word, Acheron, and a lawyer named Vance who looks like he's waiting for a funeral," Wolfe grunted. "Acheron, the river of pain, and a lawyer in a hurry. It seems, Archie, that the disruption of our orchids was merely the opening movement of a very loud and very unpleasant symphony." By the time the clock on the mantel struck 4, the atmosphere in the office had shifted from the usual afternoon lull to the sharp electric hum that precedes a gathering of people who all have something to hide. Wolfe sat in his oversized chair, his eyes half closed, his fingers performing a rhythmic dance on the edge of the mahogany desk. He was in his gathering mode, which usually meant I would be spending the next hour playing usher, bartender, and amateur psychologist. I had spent the last 2 hours on the phone, leaning on contacts and using the Sonora name like a battering ram. The result was a list of names that sounded like the social register of a particularly prestigious prison ward. They started arriving at 4:15. First was Arthur Vance, the lawyer I'd met at the penthouse. He looked even more frayed than he had that morning, his silk tie slightly askew, as if he'd spent the afternoon trying to outrun his own conscience. He didn't look at me as I showed him to one of the yellow chairs. He kept his eyes fixed on Wolfe, who ignored him with the practiced indifference of a mountain ignoring a pebble. Next came a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of ice and then dressed in a tuxedo that was a few hours early for dinner. This was Julian Vane, a distinguished friend of the family whose primary occupation seemed to be spending other people's money at the Acheron Club. He had the kind of tan that didn't come from the sun, but from high-altitude lamps and expensive lotions. He took his seat with a sneer that suggested the brownstone was significantly below his usual standards of architecture. The third arrival was a surprise, even to me. A young woman, maybe 22, with dark, restless eyes and a habit of biting her lower lip until it turned white. She introduced herself as Maya Reed, Elena's roommate from her brief stint in drama school. She looked like she had walked all the way from the village, and her coat was a direct insult to the mink Clara Sonora had worn earlier. She sat as far from Julian Vane as the furniture allowed. The room felt crowded, not because of the number of people, but because of the weight of the silence. Wolfe finally opened his eyes. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask if they wanted a drink. He simply looked at them one by one, until the silence became more uncomfortable than a direct accusation. "You are here," Wolfe said, his voice a dry rasp that filled every corner of the room, "because Miss Elena Sonora has vanished. She has vanished in a manner that involves my household, which I find intolerable. I am not interested in your social standing, your legal privileges, or your personal grievances. I am interested in the truth of her whereabouts." "This is absurd," Vane said, his voice smooth and cold. "Elena is a flighty girl. She's likely in Atlantic City or tucked away in some hotel room with a bottle of gin. To drag us here like suspects in a common precinct is an outrage." "Is it?" Wolfe turned his gaze toward Vane. "Mr. Vane, I am told you are a regular at the Acheron Club, a club where the stakes are high and the debts are higher. I am also told that Miss Sonora was seen there 3 nights ago, and that you were the one who escorted her." Vane's ice-carved face didn't melt, but a small muscle in his jaw twitched. "I'm a family friend. I look after her. Like a shepherd looks after a lamb," I cut in, leaning against the edge of my desk. "The kind of shepherd who knows exactly how much that lamb's wool is worth on the open market. We found a note in her apartment, Mr. Vane, the word Acheron and a set of numbers that look suspiciously like a debt tally. I know nothing about her finances," Vane snapped. Wolfe shifted his attention to Maya Reed. The girl looked like she wanted to bolt. "Miss Reed, you were her friend. You shared her confidence, if not her fortune. Why did she call my chef to ask about a recipe for lamb?" Maya's hands were shaking in her lap. She looked at Vance, then at Vane, then finally at Wolfe. "She wasn't asking about lamb. She was terrified. She told me she had found something in the trust papers, something Arthur did not want her to see. She said she needed a way to get a message that wouldn't look like a message. She knew Mr. Wolfe's house was the only place in the city that wouldn't be tapped or watched by the family's security." "Tapped?" Vance jumped, his voice cracking. "That's slander. The Sonora estate is handled with the utmost discretion." "Discretion is a lovely word for a cover-up," I said. "What did she find, Vance? Was it missing a few million? Or was it the fact that the charitable foundation the money reverts to is actually a shell company you and Vane have been building for 5 years? Vance rose, his face flushed. "I don't have to listen to this. This is a private residence, not a courtroom. You have no authority to hold us here." "I am not holding you," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming even more dangerous. "The door is behind you. But I should inform you that Mr. Goodwin has already spent the afternoon in communication with the district attorney's office. If you leave now, you are not leaving my office. You are entering a very public and very thorough investigation. I suggest you sit down." Vance sat. He didn't just sit, he collapsed back into the chair as if his legs had turned to water. The room was now a gallery of vultures, each waiting for the others to show a sign of weakness. There was Vane, the cold-blooded gambler, Vance, the terrified lawyer, and Maya, the girl who knew too much and had no way to protect herself. Wolfe looked at me. "Archie, it seems our suspects have provided us with a motive, a direction, and a profound lack of character. However, we are still missing the girl, and more importantly, we are missing the evidence that drove her to such a desperate culinary inquiry." "I'm on it, sir," I said, feeling the familiar itch in my feet. The office was getting too small for the amount of lying that was going on. I think it's time I took a trip to the Acheron Club. If Elena was trying to get a message out, she might have left a few more clues than just a recipe for lamb. Go, Wolfe said, closing his eyes again. And Archie, try not to lose our retainer at the baccarat table. It would be a blow to my dignity to have to bail you out. I went to the hall, grabbed my hat, and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked like a man who was about to go for a walk in a very dark forest. As I stepped out into the cool evening air of 35th Street, I knew the game had finally started. The vultures were in the office, but the prey was still out there, somewhere in the city, hiding from a source that had broken long before the phone ever rang. The Acheron Club was tucked away behind a facade of respectable limestone on 59th Street, the kind of place that didn't need a sign because if you didn't know where it was, you weren't invited. I left the sedan a block away and walked the rest of the distance, feeling the cold bite of the New York wind through my overcoat. My credentials for entering such an establishment usually consisted of a confident stride and a face that looked like it belonged to a man who could lose $1,000 without losing his appetite. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the muted clatter of chips. It was the sort of silence that only exists where a lot of money is changing hands. I bypassed the baccarat tables and headed for the bar, where a man with a face like a dried apricot was polishing a glass with more dedication than the task required. I leaned against the mahogany and ordered a bourbon, neat. Quiet night for a Tuesday, I remarked, sliding a $10 bill toward him. The bartender didn't look up. Every night is quiet if you're winning. Every night is loud if you're not. I'm looking for a friend who might have been making some noise a few nights ago, I said, keeping my voice low. Elena Sonora, blonde, looks like she belongs on a yacht, but talks like she's looking for a way off one. She was here with Julian Vane. The polishing stopped. The bartender looked at me then, his eyes flickering toward a door at the back of the room marked private. Vane is a regular. The girl, she was here. She wasn't playing, though. She was talking to the owner in the back room for an hour. When she came out, she looked like she'd seen a ghost in a silk suit. And the owner? Does he have a name, or does he just go by the ghost? Leo Kerner. But if you're thinking of knocking on that door, I'd make sure your life insurance is paid up. Leo doesn't like being interrupted when he's counting his blessings. I thanked him for the bourbon and tips, neither of which I intended to finish. I moved through the crowd, navigating between the high rollers and the hangers-on, and slipped through the door to the back hallway. It was narrower here, the air smelling of floor wax and old secrets. At the end of the hall, a beefy specimen in a dinner jacket that was straining at the seams stood guard. He looked like he'd been hired for his lack of imagination. "I'm here to see Kerner," I said, not slowing down. "Tell him Archie Goodwin is here to talk about the Sonora account. It's overdrawn." The guard hesitated. The name Sonora had a way of opening doors, even the heavy ones. He ducked inside the room and returned 10 seconds later, nodding me through. The office was a shrine to bad taste and high margins. Leo Kerner sat behind a desk that was too large for the room, wearing a suit that was too loud for the century. He had a cigar clamped in his jaw that looked like a torpedo. "Goodwin," Kerner said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "I've heard of you. You're the one doing the footwork for the fat man on 35th Street. What does Wolfe want with my club?" "Wolfe wants to know why Elena Sonora spent an hour here before she decided to vanish," I said, taking a chair without being asked. "And he wants to know why she left a note with your club's name on it next to a debt tally that would make a sultan blink." Kerner laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "The girl didn't owe me a dime. It was the other way around. Her father had a private arrangement with this club, a trust that paid out into a slush fund for his extracurricular activities. Elena found out about it. She came here wanting to know where the money was going now that her old man is pushing up daisies." "And where is it going, Leo?" "To your friend Arthur Vance," Kerner said, leaning back and blowing a plume of smoke at the ceiling. "The lawyer. He's been skimming the Sonora Trust through my books for 3 years. Elena caught the scent. She told me she was going to use the reorganization meeting to blow the whistle. She was scared, sure, but she wasn't hiding, she was hunting. Then why the call to Wolfe's chef, I asked. though the pieces were starting to click into place. Why talk about a broken sauce? Maybe she knew Vance was on to her, Cramer shrugged. Vance is a cornered rat, and rats bite. If she went to the police, the scandal would kill the estate. If she went to Wolfe, she thought she could handle it quietly. I haven't seen her since she left that night. And if I were you, Goodwin, I'd stop looking for a girl who's hiding and start looking for a body that's been hidden. I didn't like how he said it. It had the ring of a man who knew exactly how much lime it took to dissolve a dream. I left the Acheron Club with my head spinning and my stomach in a knot. I found a drugstore with a phone booth and called the brownstone. Wolfe, the voice answered on the third ring. He sounded irritated, which meant I had interrupted his reading. It's Archie. I'm at 59th. Cramer says the girl was a whistleblower, not a gambler. Vance has been stealing from the trust, and Elena has the proof. But there's a problem, sir. Cramer thinks she's already dead. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of Wolfe's breathing, rhythmic bellows. She is not dead, Wolfe said finally. If she were dead, Mr. Vance would not be sitting in my office looking like a man who is waiting for a phone to ring. He's terrified of her return, not her discovery. Archie, return to the house. And on your way, stop at the corner of 42nd and Lex. There is a newsstand run by a man named Solly. Ask him if he saw a girl in a tan coat yesterday afternoon, carrying a heavy ledger. If I am right, Elena Sonora didn't just vanish. She went to the ground with the only weapon she had. The ledger? I asked. The evidence, Wolfe corrected. The source was the signal, Archie. She wasn't asking for a recipe. She was telling us that the base of the Sonora fortune was breaking. She was at a church, you said. A bell chimed. Find that church, Archie. Find the sanctuary. We have a girl to protect and a lawyer to destroy. I would like to be finished before dinner. Fritz is preparing a roast. I hung up and stepped out into the night. The pavement was wet with a sudden drizzle, reflecting the neon lights like a sheet of black glass. I had my orders, and for once the mountain was moving. The drizzle had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of the sedan by the time I reached 42nd and Lexington. The city looked like it was being scrubbed, though most of the dirt in New York doesn't wash off that easily. Solly's newsstand was a small island of soggy paper and neon light in the middle of the sidewalk. Solly himself was wrapped in 3 sweaters and a muffler, looking like a very cold, very cynical cocoon. Solly, I said, leaning under the lip of his corrugated roof to stay dry. I'm looking for a girl, tan coat, blonde, carrying something heavy, like a ledger or a big book of secrets. Solly spat into the gutter. I see 1,000 girls, Goodwin. Half of them are blonde, and all of them have secrets. But only one of them stood here for 20 minutes yesterday, staring at the clock across the street, as if she was waiting for the world to end. She wasn't blonde, though, brown hair, short. I frowned. A wig? Or a very quick dye job? Solly shrugged. She bought a pack of peppermint and asked where the nearest place was that took sanctuary seriously. I pointed her towards St. Jude's, 3 blocks over. She was clutching a leather binder like it was her firstborn. I thanked him and headed for St. Jude's. It was an old stone structure that looked like it had been dropped into the middle of the skyscrapers by mistake. The heavy oak doors groaned as I pushed them open, and the smell of incense and old wood hit me like a physical weight. The silence inside was so thick you could have carved it. I found her in the 3rd pew from the back, huddled in a coat that had seen better days, the tan one Solly had mentioned, now darkened by rain. Her hair was indeed a dark, messy brown, but the bone structure was pure Sonora. She didn't look like an heiress. She looked like a hunted animal. Beside her, gripped in both hands, was a thick, brass-bound ledger. "Miss Sonora?" I said softly, sitting in the pew behind her. She jumped, her eyes wide and panicked. "Who are you? Did Arthur send you?" "My name is Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. Your Aunt Clara hired us, though I suspect she's more interested in the signatures you haven't signed than your well-being. And Fritz Brenner is still waiting to tell you why your sauce broke." She let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. The sauce. I didn't know what else to do. I knew Arthur was listening to my calls. I remembered the dinner at Mr. Wolfe's, how he talked about the integrity of ingredients. I thought if I mentioned a breaking base, Mr. Wolfe would understand that the trust was being liquidated from the bottom up. He understood, I told her, but the people you're running from aren't interested in cooking, they're interested in that book in your lap. I'm guessing that's the evidence Cramer mentioned? It's all here, she whispered, patting the leather cover. The double entries, the kickbacks to the Acheron Club, the way Arthur has been funneling money into a shell company called Byrne Enterprises. He's been planning this for years, waiting for the reorganization to make the theft permanent. If I sign those papers, the money vanishes into his pockets and I become a ward of a foundation that doesn't exist. We need to get you to the brownstone, I said, standing up. It's the only place in the city where Arthur Vance and his friends can't reach you. They're already here, Archie. Her voice was flat. I turned. Standing in the shadows of the vestibule were two men I didn't recognize, but whose profession was written in the set of their shoulders and the way they kept their hands in their pockets. They weren't there to pray. Behind them, silhouetted against the streetlights, was the unmistakable frantic shape of Arthur Vance. "Give it to me, Elena," Vance shouted, his voice echoing through the nave, sounding thin and desperate. "You're making this so much worse than it needs to be. Just a signature and the book, and you can go back to Paris. You can have your life back." "Her life or her silence?" I shouted back. I moved into the aisle, keeping myself between the girl and the shadows. "You're a long way from your law office, Vance, and I don't think the rector would approve of your associates." One of the men started down the side aisle, moving with a practiced predatory gait. I felt for the weight of the .38 in my shoulder holster, but I knew a shootout in a cathedral was the kind of headline Wolfe would never forgive me for. "The ledger, Archie," Elena hissed. She thrust the heavy book into my hands. "If they get me, don't let them have this." "They aren't getting anyone," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to back that up. Just then the heavy oak doors at the back of the church swung open again, but it wasn't more reinforcements for Vance. It was a man in a nondescript grey suit and a hat pulled low, looking like a shadow that had decided to go for a walk. Saul Panzer. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, looking at Vance and his two gorillas with an expression of mild boredom. Saul doesn't look like much. He's small, a bit weathered, and looks like he might be a clerk in a hardware store. But in a dark room or a tight spot, I'd take Saul over a platoon of Marines. "Vance," Saul said, his voice surprisingly loud in silence. "Mr. Wolfe is expecting the girl and the book for dinner. He's very particular about his schedule. I suggest you and your friends find another place to spend the evening." Vance looked at the two men, then at Saul, then back at me. He was calculating the odds, and for the first time that day the math wasn't in his favor. He knew Saul, or at least his reputation. "This isn't over," Vance spat, but he was already backing toward the door. "The law is on my side. I'm the executor, and I'm the man who's going to see you disbarred before the week is out," I countered. Vance and his shadows retreated into the rain, the heavy doors thudding shut behind them. I looked at Elena, who was shaking so hard the pew was rattling. Then I looked at Saul. "Nice timing," I said. "Wolfe had a feeling," Saul replied, stepping forward. "He said if you were looking for sanctuary, you'd probably find someone trying to violate it. Let's go. Fritz has the lamb in the oven, and you know how Wolfe gets when the meat is overdone." We led Elena out a side entrance. The city felt different now, less like a trap and more like a puzzle that was finally being solved. We had the girl, we had the ledger, and we had a mountain on 35th Street waiting to lower the boom. The sedan moved through the slick New York streets with a rhythmic precision that usually settled my nerves, but tonight the air inside the car was as heavy as a lead pipe. Elena Sonora sat in the back seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather strap of the door, her eyes darting toward every set of headlights that trailed us. Saul Panzer was at the wheel, his cap pulled low, driving with the effortless competence of a man who could navigate a maze in a blackout. I sat in the passenger seat, the brass-bound ledger resting on my lap like a ticking bomb. It was cold, heavy, and smelled of old ink and 1,000 little betrayals. "They'll try again," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tires. Arthur isn't just a lawyer, he's the architect of the Sonora name now. He won't let that book reach Mr. Wolfe. He doesn't have much choice, I said, turning slightly to look at her. He's already tipped his hand in the house of God. That's a move of a desperate man, not a powerful one. Besides, you're about to enter the only fortress in Manhattan that doesn't have a mortgage. Once those doors on 35th Street close behind you, Arthur Vance might as well be trying to sue a hurricane. Saul caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Archie, we've got a tail, black sedan 2 cars back. They've been with us since we crossed 42nd. They're good, but they're not trying to be invisible anymore. I looked back. There it was, a dark shape weaving through the traffic with a bit too much purpose. Vance's guerrillas, they must have regrouped faster than I thought. Can we lose them, Saul? In this rain I could lose a ghost, Saul said, a small grim smile touching his lips. He didn't accelerate. Instead, he slowed down, timing the light at 38th Street. Just as the yellow flickered, he yanked the wheel, sending the sedan into a sharp, controlled skid down a narrow delivery alley. We bounced over crates and splashed through puddles that looked like small lakes. Saul took a hard left, then a right, navigating a series of back streets that weren't on any map I'd ever seen. The black sedan vanished from the mirror. Saul didn't relax, and neither did I. We took the long way around, doubling back through the garment district before finally pulling up to the curb in front of the old brownstone. The stoop was bathed in the warm, steady glow of the porch light, a beacon of stubborn tradition in a city that was moving too fast. "Out," I told Elena. "Keep your head down and move straight to the door." We made the dash. I had the key out and the bolt thrown before the rain could even soak through my hat. Once we were inside, the smell of Fritz's cooking, roast lamb with a hint of rosemary and garlic, hit us like a homecoming. It was the smell of safety, of order, and of a man who didn't let kidnapping or grand larceny interfere with the dinner hour. Wolfe was in the office, but he wasn't behind his desk. He was standing by the globe, his back to us, appearing to study the distance between New York and the South Pacific. He didn't turn when we entered. "The girl is here, sir," I announced, "and the evidence. We had a bit of a run-in at St. Jude's and a scenic tour of the side streets with Saul, but we're intact." Wolfe turned slowly. He looked at Elena, his gaze sweeping over her rain-soaked coat and her dyed, messy hair. There was no pity in his eyes. Wolfe finds pity to be a messy emotion, but there was a flicker of something that might have been respect for a woman who had the sense to use a source as a distress signal. "Miss Sonora," Wolfe said, his voice a deep, resonant bass, "you have caused a great deal of commotion for Tuesday. I trust the ledger was worth the dampness of your attire." Elena stepped forward and placed the book on his desk. "It's all in there, Mr. Wolfe. The Byrne Enterprises accounts, the kickbacks to Leo Kerner, my father's private ledgers that Arthur thought he'd burned. It's enough to send him to prison for the rest of his life." Wolfe sat in his chair, the springs groaning in familiar protest. He pulled the ledger toward him, his large, sensitive fingers tracing the brass edges. "Arthur Vance is a small man with large ambitions. Such men are predictable. They believe that if they can control the paper, they can control reality. They forget that paper can be burned, but logic is immutable." "He's outside, sir," Saul said, standing by the door. "He and his men. They're parked half a block down. They aren't coming in, but they're waiting for her to come out." "Let them wait," Wolfe muttered, opening the ledger to the first page. "They are irrelevant. The pressure is already beginning to mount, though they do not feel the squeeze yet. Archie, call the Acheron Club. Tell Mr. Kerner that I have the Sonora ledger, and that I am currently deciding whether to hand it to the district attorney or to a certain investigative reporter at the Gazette who owes me a favor. Tell him I shall expect him here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." "And Vance?" I asked. "Mr. Vance will come without an invitation," Wolfe said, his eyes already moving down a column of figures. "He's a rat, as you so eloquently put it, and a rat will always return to the cheese scene. Now Fritz has been waiting. Miss Sonora, I suggest you wash. We do not allow the scent of panic to spoil a good Bordeaux bouquet. We shall dine, and then we shall prepare for the final movement of this tiresome drama." As Elena followed Fritz toward the guest room, I looked at Wolfe. He was already lost in the numbers, his lips moving slightly as he performed the mental gymnastics that made him the most dangerous man in the city. The brownstone was quiet, the storm was outside, and the mountain was at work. I went to the kitchen to help Fritz with the wine. I knew that tomorrow the office would be full of vultures, and Wolfe would be the one holding the knife. The morning sun filtered through the south windows of the office, illuminating the dust motes that danced over the rows of books, but the warmth didn't reach the atmosphere inside the room. It was Wednesday, the day Wolfe usually dedicated to repotting the Miltonia hybrids, but the orchids would have to wait. The brownstone felt like a coiled spring. Elena Sonora was upstairs in the south bedroom, under strict orders from Wolfe not to so much as glance out a window. Saul Panzer was stationed in the front room with a newspaper and a grim sense of purpose. Wolfe was behind his desk, having finished a breakfast of shirred eggs and blackcurrant preserves. He was currently occupied with the ledger I had retrieved from St. Jude's. He hadn't just read it, he had dissected it. There were scraps of yellow paper sticking out from the pages like tiny flags of surrender. To Wolfe, those columns of figures weren't just math, they were a biography of greed, a map of how Arthur Vance had systematically dismantled a dead man's legacy to build a monument to himself. Archie, Wolfe said, not looking up from a particularly damning entry regarding a dummy corporation in Delaware. The phone calls. "All placed, sir," I reported from my desk. "Leo Kerner sounded like he was chewing on glass, but he'll be here. He knows that if he doesn't show, I'll be on the phone with the Gaming Commission before his first baccarat table opens tonight." Julian Vane was harder to move. He tried to claim a prior engagement with a polo pony, but I mentioned the ledger and the name Byrne Enterprises, and he suddenly found a gap in his schedule. "Maya Reed is coming because she's the only one in this mess who actually cares if Elena is breathing. And Vance, well, Vance is already here." I gestured toward the monitor. A black sedan had been idling across the street for an hour, and a second one had just pulled up behind it. Arthur Vance wasn't hiding anymore. He was playing the role of the righteous executor preparing to storm the castle. "Let him simmer," Wolfe murmured. "A man in a hurry makes mistakes. A man who is forced to wait begins to imagine the mistakes he has already made. It is the imagination, Archie, that is the most effective tool of the interrogator." "I thought that was the rubber hose," I said, leaning back. "But I'll take my imagination if it keeps the carpet clean. What's the play, sir? We have the book, we have the girl, and we have a room full of people who hate each other. Are we just going to point a finger and wait for someone to faint?" Wolfe closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. "We are going to demonstrate the inevitability of their collapse. Mr. Vance believes he has a choice, the girl's signature or her silence. I am going to show him that he has neither. He has already lost the Sonora fortune. He is now merely haggling over the length of his prison sentence. But for the demonstration to be effective, we must ensure the audience is properly seated. Has the guest arrived?" The guest was a surprise addition to the guest list, a man I'd spent 3 hours tracking down the previous night while Wolfe was finishing his beer. His name was Emil Hatch, and he was the former head bookkeeper for the Sonora estate before Vance had retired him 2 years ago. I had found him in a cramped apartment in Queens, surrounded by cats and a very justified grudge. "He's in the dining room with Fritz," I said. "Fritz is feeding him griddle cakes and coffee. He's ready to testify to anything from grand larceny to the way Vance steals paper clips." "Excellent." Wolfe glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9. "Archie, open the door. The vultures are circling, and I find the noise of their wings distracting. Let us bring them into the cage." I went to the front door. The air outside was crisp, the previous night's rain having left the city feeling raw and exposed. Julian Vane was the first out of his car, looking impeccably groomed and entirely lethal. Leo Kerner followed, his hands deep in the pockets of a dark overcoat, looking like a man who was counting the exits. And finally, Arthur Vance hit the pavement. He looked like he hadn't slept since the Eisenhower administration. His eyes were bloodshot, and his skin had the grey waxy sheen of a cheap candle. I didn't say a word as I ushered them in. I didn't need to. The silence of the brownstone did the heavy lifting. I led them into the office where Maya Reed was already sitting, her face pale but determined. Wolfe remained seated, his face an impenetrable mask of granite. He didn't rise, he didn't nod. He simply waited until they had all found their places in the yellow chairs. Vance was the last to sit. He didn't look at Wolfe. He looked at the ledger sitting on the desk. "I want that book, Wolfe," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. "It is property of the Sonora estate, of which I am the legal representative." "You are in possession of stolen goods." "A legal representative," Wolfe repeated, the words sounding like an insult. A fascinating title for a man who has spent the last 36 months cannibalizing the very body he was sworn to protect. "You are not here to claim property, Mr. Vance. You are here to witness the liquidation of your career." Wolfe signaled to me. I went to the dining room door and opened it. Emil Hatch walked in, clutching a tattered briefcase. When Vance saw him, the last bit of color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a silk suit. "The net is closed, Archie," Wolfe said softly, his eyes never leaving Vance. "Now, we shall see who has the stomach for the truth." The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the heavy, labored breathing of a man who realized he was no longer the hunter. The pressure was at its peak, and Wolfe was just beginning. The office was no longer a room, it had become a crucible. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, Wolfe's beer, and the cold, metallic sweat of people who realized the floor was no longer solid beneath them. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his bulk immovable, his eyes directed at the center of the room with the terrifying focus of a grandmaster who had already seen the checkmate 12 moves ago. I stood by the door, my back to the wood, feeling the weight of the .38 in my holster, and the even heavier weight of the silence. "We are all here," Wolfe began, his voice surprisingly soft. It was a murmur that commanded every ear in the room. Mr. Vance, the legal architect of a ruin, Mr. Vane, the parasite who provided the social cover for the theft, Mr. Kerner, the ledger keeper for the underworld, and Miss Reed, the only one among you who hasn't mistaken greed for a personality trait. "This is a farce," Julian Vane said, though the usual ice in his voice was starting to crack. He adjusted his cufflink, a nervous gesture that betrayed him. "You brought in a disgruntled ex-employee and a girl who's probably hallucinating from a 3-day bender. You have no standing, Wolfe. You are a private citizen playing at being a judge." Wolfe didn't even glance at him. "I am not playing, Mr. Vane. Play requires an opponent who understands the rules. You merely understand the price of things. Mr. Hatch, if you please." Emil Hatch stepped forward, his fingers trembling as he opened his briefcase. He pulled out a sheaf of papers, carbon copies, old and yellowed, but legible. "I kept them," Hatch said, his voice thin but steady. "When Mr. Vance told me I was too old to handle the Sonora accounts, I knew why." He started moving the capital from the mining stocks into Byrne Enterprises in late 1957. "I have the original transfer authorizations. The estate board didn't sign them, they were forged. I couldn't go to the police then. Vance threatened to have my pension revoked and my name dragged through the dirt. But when Archie Goodwin found me, I realized the girl was in danger. Elena is the only one who can stop the reorganization." Arthur Vance was staring at the floor, his face the color of wet cement. He looked like a man who was trying to remember if he'd turned off the stove in a house that was already burned to the ground. "The forgery was the beginning," Wolfe continued, his fingers interlaced over his waistcoat. "But the reorganization was the goal. By moving the assets into a charitable foundation, Mr. Vance and Mr. Vane intended to create a vacuum, a foundation with no oversight, governed by a board of their own choosing. The Sonora fortune would have become a private treasury for the Acheron Club's expansion and Mr. Vance's political aspirations. The only obstacle was Elena Sonora's signature and her life. If she signed, the theft was legalized. If she died before signing, the estate would have fallen into a protracted legal battle that Mr. Vance, as executor, would have controlled for decades. "You can't prove I tried to kill her," Vance rasped, finally looking up. His eyes were wild. "She ran away. She's unstable." "She didn't run," I interrupted. "She went to the ground. She knew you were listening to her phone, Vance. She knew that every friend she had was on your payroll. That's why she called this house. She knew that if there was one man in New York who couldn't be bought, bullied or bored into looking the other way, it was the man sitting in that oversized chair." Wolfe shifted his gaze to Leo Kerner. "Mr. Kerner, you are a businessman of a certain elasticity. You realize that Mr. Vance was a liability the moment he started chasing the girl into churches with hired thugs. You are here because you have decided to save yourself. Tell us about the consulting fees paid to the Acheron Club." Kerner took a slow breath, looking at Vance with pure contempt. "He's a loser, Wolfe. He's been using the trust to cover his markers at my tables for 2 years. When the girl started asking questions, he panicked. He asked me to find her and make sure she didn't make it to the meeting. I told him, I don't do that kind of work. I'm a gambler, not a butcher." "Liar," Vance screamed, half rising from his chair. "You took the money. You took every cent." "Sit down, Arthur," Julian Vane said, his voice now entirely devoid of its earlier silk. He looked at his partner in crime with the disgust one might feel for a cockroach that had failed to stay under the baseboard. "It's over. The fat man has the book, he has the bookkeeper, and he has the girl." "I do indeed have the girl," Wolfe said. He pressed a button on his desk. A moment later, the dining room door opened again. Elena Sonora walked in. She was no longer wearing the wet, stained coat or the desperate expression of the fugitive. She had washed. Her blonde hair was brushed back, and she wore a dark dress that Fritz had managed to have pressed. She looked exactly like what she was, the owner of everything in the room that wasn't bolted to the floor. She walked straight to the desk and stood beside Wolfe. She didn't look at Vance with anger. She looked at him with a cold, devastating clarity. "The reorganization meeting is at 2:00 today, Arthur," she said. "I'll be there, but I won't be signing the papers you drafted. I'll be signing a power of attorney for Mr. Wolfe's associates and a criminal complaint for the district attorney. I suggest you use the next 3 hours to find a lawyer who isn't a thief. Although, in your circles, I imagine that will be difficult." Vance slumped back. The fight was gone. He looked smaller than he had that morning, shrunken by the weight of the truth and the immovable presence of the man across the desk. Wolfe leaned back, a faint, almost invisible expression of satisfaction crossing his face. "Archie, call Inspector Cramer. Tell him I have a collection of individuals who are in desperate need of a change of scenery, and tell him to bring a large car. We have quite a few vultures to transport." The room remained still as I went to the phone. The gathering was over. The strategy had worked, the bait had been taken, and the sanctity of the brownstone was about to be restored. All that remained was justice delivery and lunch delivery. Inspector Cramer arrived with the air of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a reasonably pleasant cigar and was determined to make someone pay for it. He stood in the center of the office, his grey suit rumpled, and his jaw working on a piece of gum, as if it were the leg of a prime suspect. He looked at the assembled group, the cowering lawyer, the frozen socialite, and the gambler who looked like he was already calculating the odds of a hung jury, and then he looked at Wolfe. "All right, Wolfe," Cramer barked, his voice echoing off the rows of leather-bound books. "I've got 3 squad cars double-parked and a sergeant who's missed his lunch. You said you had a collection. More like a funeral for a high society scandal. Who am I taking and what's the charge besides making me drive in this traffic?" Wolfe didn't look up from the beer he had just poured. He waited for the phone to settle with agonizing deliberation. "Patience, Inspector. A man of your experience should know that a gift-wrapped collar requires a bit of ribbon. Archie, the ledger." I stepped forward and handed the brass-bound book to Cramer. He took it, flipped through a few pages, and his eyebrows began a slow climb toward his hairline. "This looks like the Sonora books." The ones that went missing from the estate office 2 nights ago. Missing is a relative term, Wolfe said, setting the glass down. They were rescued. They contain the meticulous record of Mr. Arthur Vance's career as a parasite. You will find that the entries starting on page 42 do not correspond with the official filings at the surrogate's court. They do, however, correspond perfectly with the deposits made into the Byrne Enterprises account, a shell company controlled by Mr. Vance and facilitated by the hospitality of Mr. Kerner's establishment. It's all lies, Vance said, though his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I was protecting the assets. The girl is incompetent. Protecting them for whom? Elena Sonora's voice was like a blade. She stepped out from behind my desk, her eyes locked on Vance. You weren't protecting the assets, Arthur. You were harvesting them. You knew that once I signed those reorganization papers, the trail would be buried under a mountain of charitable bureaucracy. You didn't count on me finding the second set of books in my father's private wall safe. And you certainly didn't count on me getting out of that apartment alive. Cramer turned his gaze to Vance, his eyes narrowing. We had a report of a disturbance at St. Jude's last night. A few hoods trying to muscle a girl into a car. Do you know anything, Vance? Or maybe Mr. Vane here can explain why his personal driver was seen 2 blocks away at the time.
Julian Vane didn't say a word. He looked at the ceiling as if he were trying to remember the lyrics to a song he'd heard once in a club. He knew the game was up. In his world, when the police start talking about license plates and eyewitnesses, the only thing left to do is call a more expensive lawyer than the one currently being handcuffed. The charge, Inspector, Wolfe said, his voice gaining a bit of its authoritative edge, is multifaceted. Grand larceny, embezzlement and conspiracy to commit a felony. I believe you will also find that Mr. Vance's associates were prepared to use physical coercion to obtain a signature on a fraudulent document. That is a matter for the district attorney, but the evidence in that ledger is quite sufficient to keep them in your care for the afternoon. Cramer grunted, a sound that passed for a thank you in his vocabulary. He signaled the 2 uniformed officers waiting in the hall. All right, let's go. Vance, Vane, Kerner, you're all coming downtown. And bring the bookkeeper too. I want to hear what he has to say about these carbon copies. As the office cleared out, the tension that had been building for 48 hours began to dissipate like steam. The room felt larger, cleaner. Maya Reed approached Elena and took her hand. They didn't say anything, they didn't need to. They had survived a predatory world by the narrowest of margins, and they were still standing. Wolfe remained in his chair, watching the departure with the detached interest of a man watching a play he had written himself. Once the front door had finally closed and the sirens had faded into the midtown hum, he turned to me. Archie, the check, on the desk, sir, I said, pointing to the $5,000 retainer, and I suspect there will be another one coming once the estate is settled. We've saved the Sonora fortune, protected a life, and managed to annoy Inspector Cramer. I'd say that's a pretty good return for a couple of days' work. Wolfe grunted, but it wasn't a dissatisfied sound. He looked at the empty yellow chairs and then the clock. It was nearly lunch. The fortune is irrelevant, Archie. The logic was the thing. Men like Vance believe the world is a chaotic place where the loudest liar wins. He needed to be reminded that facts are stubborn things and that they have a tendency to congregate in this office. He looked at Elena. Miss Sonora, you have shown a commendable grasp of the importance of a well-constructed base, both in sources and in life. I trust you will find a more suitable attorney for your future endeavors, one who does not confuse his client's ledger with his own pocketbook. I think I've learned my lesson, Mr. Wolfe, Elena said, a small, genuine smile appearing on her face. And the next time I have a question about a recipe, I'll make sure it's actually about the food. See what you do, Wolfe murmured, already reaching for the bell to signal Fritz. Now, if you will excuse me, the disruption of my household has reached its conclusion. There is a leg of lamb that requires my undivided attention, and I find that justice, while satisfying, is a poor substitute for a properly prepared meal. I walked the ladies to the door, feeling the familiar satisfaction of a closed file.
The brownstone was returning to its natural state of quiet, ordered intellectualism. Vultures were caged, orchids were waiting, and the mountain was hungry. The front door clicked shut, the heavy thud of the bolt providing a final punctuation mark to the exodus of lawyers, gamblers, and the long-suffering police force. The street outside was reclaiming its mid-morning rhythm, the sirens of the departing squad cars becoming a faint, receding wail against the permanent hum of the city. Inside the brownstone, the silence returned, thick and comfortable, like a heavy wool blanket that had been momentarily tossed aside and was now being smoothed back into place. I walked back into the office. The yellow chairs had been straightened, but the ghost of the morning's tension still lingered in the faint scent of Vance's sour cologne and the lingering ozone of a high-stakes confrontation. Wolfe was already in motion, not physically, of course, as he remained seated with the permanence of a gargoyle, but his mind had clearly shifted gears. The ledger was gone, tucked into the back of the safe. The $5,000 check had been pinned to the desk blotter by a bronze paperweight in the shape of a bull. "Well," I said, leaning against the edge of my desk and stretching my legs. "The vultures are in the cage, the heiress is in a taxi, and the bank account is $5,000 heavier. I'd say the disruption was worth the wear on the carpet, though I'll probably have to spend an hour tomorrow convincing the florist that we weren't actually running a private detective agency out of the orchid rooms." Wolfe didn't look up. He was occupied with the 3 bottles of beer Fritz had brought on a silver tray. He opened the first one with a practiced flick of the wrist, the hiss of carbonation providing much more pleasant sound than Arthur Vance's whining. He poured the beer into a glass, watching the head rise with the focused intensity of a chemist monitoring a life-saving reaction. "The disruption, Archie, is never worth the price," Wolfe murmured, finally taking a sip. "It is merely a tax we pay for existing in a world populated by individuals who cannot distinguish between their desires and their rights." Mr. Vance was no anomaly, he was a symptom. He believed that because he was the executor of the estate, he was the author of the reality. It is a common delusion among the mediocre. "Maybe so," I said, "but the mediocre one nearly won this round. If Elena hadn't been smart enough to use Fritz as a relay, she'd be signing her life away in some airless boardroom right now, or worse, you have to admit, using a broken sauce as a metaphor for a collapsing trust fund was a nice touch. She has a bit of your flair for the dramatic, even if she doesn't have your appetite." Wolfe's lip curled slightly, a gesture that for him was the equivalent of a belly laugh. "Do not insult me, Archie. The girl was desperate, not dramatic. She reached for the only thing she knew was solid in a world that had turned to water. She remembered that in this house, ingredients are respected. A sauce breaks when the emulsion fails. When the disparate elements refuse to hold together under pressure, it was a precise, if somewhat frantic, application of culinary logic." Fritz appeared at the door, his face shining with the quiet pride of a man whose kitchen had been vindicated. "Lunch is served, Mr. Wolfe. The leg of the lamb is resting, and the soup is, I assure you, quite stable." Wolfe rose, his great bulk shifting with a slow, tectonic grace. "Thank you, Fritz. We shall be there momentarily." He turned his eyes to me, the golden yellow flecks in them sharp and observant. "Archie, you will find that the check on my desk is sufficient to cover the expenses, including a new suit for yourself, should you feel the need to replace the one currently smelling of damp cathedral pews." "I'll take the suit," I said, following him toward the dining room. "But I think I'll keep the memories for free. It's not every day I get to see a Park Avenue lawyer turn the color of an overcooked turnip." We moved into the dining room, where the sunlight was hitting the silver and the crystal with a brilliance that made the events of the last 48 hours feel like a fever dream. The table was set with a precision that bordered on the religious. There was no talk of ledgers, no mention of the Acheron Club, and certainly no discussion of the district attorney. In this room, the only justice that mattered was palate justice. As Wolfe took his place at the head of the table, he paused, his hand hovering over the linen napkin. "The tragedy of the Vances of this world, Archie, is not their greed. Greed is a natural, if lamentable, human impulse. Their true crime is their lack of taste. They wish to possess the fortune, yet they have no idea how to spend it. They accumulate power like a squirrel accumulates nuts, with no regard for the quality of the harvest. They live in a perpetual state of hunger that no amount of stolen capital can ever satisfy. He sat, the chair sighing under his weight. To steal for the sake of survival is a tragedy. Stealing for power is evil, but to steal for the sake of a foundation one does not even intend to fund, that is a folly so profound it borders on the metaphysical. I'll remember that next time I'm tempted to embezzle the petty cash, I said, unfolding my own napkin. It's all about the quality of the nuts. Wolfe offered a grunt that might have been an agreement, or might have just been an acknowledgement that the lamb had arrived. Fritz set the platter down, and the aroma of rosemary and garlic filled the air, effectively erasing the last traces of the city's grime. The brownstone is once again a sanctuary, Wolfe said, taking the carving knife. The orchids are blooming, the cellar is full, and the vultures have been relocated to a more appropriate habitat. We have done our duty to intellectual justice, Archie. Now let us do our duty to the lamb. I watched him work the knife with the skill of a surgeon, his world reduced to the perfect slice of meat and the ideal consistency of the sauce. Outside, New York was still a mess of deception and ambition. But here, between the four walls of the old house on 35th Street, things made sense. You know, sir, I said as I took my first bite, Elena might actually make a decent cook someday. If she can survive the Sonora estate, a bechamel shouldn't be too much trouble. Wolfe swallowed, dabbed his lips with the napkin, and looked at me with a steady, unblinking gaze. She has the prerequisite, Archie. She knows when the base has broken. Most people spend their entire lives eating a ruined sauce and wondering why it tastes of ash. I didn't have a comeback for that. I just reached for the wine and wondered if the next person to ring the doorbell would have a problem that could be solved with a recipe, or if we were back to the usual routine of murder and mayhem. Either way, the beer was cold, the lamb was perfect, and the mountain was at peace.